The M26 Pershing carried a 90mm gun that could defeat a Tiger's frontal plate at combat range. Yet it reached the front lines only 3 months before the war in Europe ended. The delay wasn't technical. By mid-1944, Normandy had become a grinding attritional fight, and Sherman crews were taking severe losses to Panthers and Tigers, whose guns could penetrate the M4 from well beyond the range at which the Sherman's 75mm could reply. Wehrmacht troops supposedly called the Sherman a Ronson, after the lighter brand, though no solid wartime source confirms the nickname. It appears to be a post-war addition to the mythology. What is confirmed is that a heavier, better-armed American tank already existed in prototype form, while Sherman losses mounted. Army Ground Forces Command chose not to rush it into production, and the reasons had more to do with doctrine and logistics than with any flaw in the vehicle itself. The origins of the project go back to the fall of 1942, when the Ordnance Department began responding to field requests for a tank that prioritized protection and firepower over speed. Frontline tankers wanted something that could absorb a hit and still shoot back hard enough to kill any opposing vehicle, even if that meant accepting a heavier, slower machine. The Sherman worked well in mobile operations, exploitation, pursuit, flanking across open terrain. In a direct engagement against a Panther at typical hedgerow ranges, it was overmatched in both armor and gun performance. Ordnance laid out specifications that were ambitious for 1942. No more than 32 tons, a 75mm gun, frontal armor of at least 100mm, and a top speed of 25 miles per hour. Satisfying all four constraints at once turned out to be impractical with available power plants and armor steel, and the program splintered into a series of prototypes numbered T-20 through T-26 as engineers tested different combinations of drivetrain, suspension, and armament. The T-23 received an experimental electric transmission from General Electric, intended to simplify shifting under load and provide smoother torque delivery to the sprockets. The concept had real appeal. Electric drive eliminated the conventional gearbox entirely, replacing it with a generator motor arrangement that allowed infinitely variable speed control. In practice, though, the electrical components added significant weight, and the system proved fragile under the shock loads of cross-country driving. A separate team explored an autoloader mechanism to raise the rate of fire, a concept that, if it had worked, would have put the vehicle ahead of any contemporary tank in sustained firepower. The mechanism used a revolving drum that held several rounds and fed them to the breech mechanically. It jammed repeatedly during trials, particularly when the vehicle was moving over rough ground and the ammunition shifted in its stowage, and the idea was shelved after several months of unsuccessful refinement. What finally worked was a hydraulic transmission built around a General Motors torque converter. Less elegant than the electric drive but far more tolerant of abuse, and reliable enough for mass production on existing factory lines. Power came from a Ford GAF gasoline engine that pushed the vehicle to about 30 miles per hour on roads, meeting the original speed target. The suspension used torsion bars, 6 road wheels per side, and 5 return rollers, with the drive sprocket moved to the rear of the hull, a departure from earlier American tank designs where the sprocket sat at the front. By early 1944, the configuration had stabilized as the T-26E1. It incorporated the strongest elements of the earlier prototypes, but at a cost and weight that the designers had not originally planned for. Instead of the specified 32 tons, the tank scaled at 43.2, roughly 8.5 tons heavier than a standard Sherman. It did meet the armor goal of 100mm on the glacis plate and carried a 90mm gun, a major step up from the 75mm, giving it genuine capability against German heavy armor at realistic combat distances. The reaction from Army Ground Forces headquarters was indifferent. The Sherman was already in mass production, Supply chains were established across multiple factories, and hundreds of thousands of crewmen were trained on it. Senior commanders did not see the Panther and Tiger as a crisis-level threat. Intelligence estimates suggested these vehicles would appear only in limited numbers compared to the older Panzer IVs and Stu-G assault guns that still made up the bulk of German armored strength. Underlying this judgment was a doctrinal assumption that had been baked into American armored thinking since before the war. Tanks existed to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, while purpose-built tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine would handle enemy armor. The Wolverine had a capable 3-inch gun and good automotive mobility, but almost no armor protection, since the doctrine assumed it would fight from concealed, pre-selected positions rather than slugging it out in the open. The logic held together in planning exercises and war games. Normandy would test it against something less cooperative. When the Allies landed in June 1944, the Sherman was considered adequate for the expected opposition. It was not. Panthers, first encountered at Anzio in smaller numbers, now constituted a large share of German armored strength in the Bocage country of Normandy. Their well-sloped frontal armor deflected 75mm rounds at normal engagement distances, while their own long 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's hull plate with little difficulty at ranges where the American crews couldn't effectively shoot back. The engagement arithmetic was simple and grim. A Panther crew could open fire at 1,500 meters with a reasonable chance of a kill, while the Sherman had to close to under 500 meters for any hope of a penetration on the front aspect. Casualties among tank crews climbed fast, and the pool of trained replacements was too small to keep pace. Training a competent tank crew took months, and the losses in Normandy were consuming them faster than the replacement pipeline could deliver. The tank destroyer concept fared no better in practice. Wolverines were vulnerable to any caliber hit that found them, and the ambush tactics the doctrine relied on worked poorly during offensive operations through hedgerow country. Where the attacker had to push forward into ground, the defender had prepared, and where concealed positions constantly shifted as the line moved. Field commanders sent increasingly urgent requests for a vehicle that could stand up to German armor in a direct fight. The institutional response was slow, tangled in production priorities and competing demands from other programs. By the time Army leadership turned serious attention to accelerating the T-26E1 program, months of factory retooling, supplier negotiations, and supply chain adjustments still lay ahead. The first Pershings did not reach the European theater until February 1945, with Germany's surrender less than 100 days away. They were parceled out in small numbers to the 3rd Armored and 9th Armored Divisions within General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. Crews who received the new tanks noticed the difference immediately. 100 millimeters of cast and rolled steel on the front hull was a different category of protection from what the Sherman offered. The first engagement came on February 25, 1945, near the Roer River, and the initial results were encouraging. The M26 could take hits that would have destroyed a Sherman, and its gun could engage targets at ranges the 75mm couldn't reach. The following day, a Pershing nicknamed Fireball was knocked out by a Tiger in an ambush near the town of Elsdorf, the first confirmed combat loss of the type, though the vehicle was later recovered and returned to service. The T-26E3 was formally standardized as the M26 Pershing, named for General John J. Blackjack Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. In late 1944, the vehicle had been reclassified from medium to heavy tank. The stated reason was morale. Crews reportedly felt more assured operating something officially designated heavy, rather than a medium tank that happened to be larger than the Sherman. Whether that label change affected combat performance is doubtful, but the Army considered crew confidence worth managing through administrative means as well as hardware. Belton Cooper, an ordnance officer with the 3rd Armored Division's Combat Command, described the arrival of the Pershings in his post-war memoir, Death Traps. 10 tanks reached the division in early February 1945, and according to Cooper, crews gathered around the new machines with visible relief, examining the thicker armor plate and the long-barreled 90mm tube. Cooper argued that the tanks could have arrived much sooner had it not been for resistance within the Army's institutional structure. The central figure in that resistance, as most historians of the program agree, was General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces and the principal advocate of the tank destroyer doctrine. McNair held that the Sherman was sufficient for its infantry support role, and that enemy tanks should be engaged by specialized destroyers rather than by heavier tanks that would strain logistics. The impasse broke in December 1943, when General Jacob Devers appealed directly to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and secured authorization for production of 250 T-26E1 units. Cooper also noted that General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, preferred the Sherman for operational and logistical reasons and resisted introducing the heavier vehicle into his formations. Patton's objections were grounded in how he fought. The Sherman consumed less fuel, a real concern during the kind of rapid advances Patton favored across France, and its lighter weight gave it better road speed, longer range between refueling, and the ability to cross bridges that might not support 43 tons. A heavy tank didn't fit the operational tempo Patton wanted to maintain. There was also a perception gap. At the time these debates were happening, the scale of Sherman losses to German armor had not yet registered at the highest command levels in the way it had in the field. Casualty reports were compiled as numbers on staff summaries, and aggregated statistics convey the situation differently than the view from the turret hatch at dawn. While the institutional argument about fielding the Pershing continued, engineers worked on pushing its firepower further. The standard 90mm M3 gun was roughly comparable to the Tiger I's 88mm KWK-36 in penetration performance, but it couldn't match the longer, higher velocity 88mm KWK-43 mounted on the Tiger II. To close that gap, Ordnance developed the T-15E1, a 90mm gun with a 73 caliber barrel and an enlarged chamber that accepted more powerful propellant charges. Muzzle velocity reached approximately 3,750 feet per second, and the round could penetrate about 10 inches of homogeneous steel plate at optimal range, enough to defeat a Tiger's front armor at over 1,000 yards, which no standard-issue American tank gun could do at the time. The T-15E1 was mounted on a T-26E1 hull in January 1945, producing what troops informally called the Super Pershing. The practical problem was the ammunition. One-piece rounds, roughly 50 inches long, that were difficult to stow in the turret's ammunition racks and physically demanding to load, especially in the confined fighting compartment during combat. The loading difficulty was a genuine tactical limitation, not merely an inconvenience. Each round had to be muscled into the breech by hand in a space that allowed the loader little room to maneuver, and under fire the additional seconds per round narrowed the advantage that the superior gun otherwise provided. A well-drilled crew on a standard Pershing could manage perhaps 6 to 8 aimed rounds per minute. The T-15E1's ammunition cut that rate substantially. Despite this, Command sent one Super Pershing to Europe for field evaluation, reasoning that even a single vehicle with that gun would provide useful data about what was possible. The vehicle saw action in the final weeks of the war, engaging German armor in several encounters and confirming the gun's lethality against every type of armor it faced, including at least one engagement with a German heavy tank that demonstrated the T-15E1's ability to penetrate at ranges the standard 90mm could not. The vehicle remained a single prototype in theater, however, and never influenced the broader tactical picture. A second prototype, built on the T-26E3 chassis, used the modified T-15E2 gun with two-piece separately loaded ammunition that reduced the physical strain on the loader by splitting the round into a projectile and a separate propellant charge. 25 production units of that variant were built under the designation T-26E4, but none arrived in time for combat. In the post-war years, 2 additional M26 hulls were fitted with the T-54 gun, similar barrel length but with a shorter, wider cartridge case that preserved muzzle energy while being somewhat more manageable inside the turret. Designated M26E1, these vehicles produced good results in testing, but post-war budget reductions halted further work in that direction. The standard production Pershing, meanwhile, represented a clear generational advance over the Sherman in 2 of the 3 areas that matter most in tank design. In firepower and protection, the M26 was substantially superior to the M4. The trade-off came in mobility and mechanical reliability. The Pershing used the same Ford GAF engine as the M4A3 Sherman, but in a hull that weighed roughly 10 tons more. Acceleration was noticeably sluggish, and crews found the tank underpowered on inclines and soft ground. The transmission, also derived from the lighter vehicle's drivetrain, operated near its mechanical limits and failed with discouraging frequency, particularly under sustained use. Maintenance crews found themselves spending disproportionate time on Pershings, compared to Shermans that could cover hundreds of miles between major services. The European War ended before these reliability problems became tactically decisive, but peacetime testing and extended field use exposed every weakness thoroughly. In May 1946, the Army conducted a broad review of its armored doctrine and redesignated the Pershing as a medium tank, reversing the late war reclassification to heavy that had been made largely for crew morale purposes. The decision reflected a more realistic assessment of where the M26 fit in the weight and capability spectrum. Engineers set about correcting the identified powertrain deficiencies through a systematic program of redesign, and by 1948, the M26E2 modification appeared with a completely new Continental AV 1790 engine, an air-cooled V12 that produced substantially more horsepower than the Ford GAF, paired with a redesigned Allison cross-drive transmission that combined steering, braking, and gear selection in a single unit. The combination finally gave the chassis the power and reliability it needed to operate as a true medium tank, rather than an overloaded hull, struggling with its own weight. The improved vehicle entered production as the M46 and was named after George Patton, the same general who had preferred the Sherman during the war and resisted the Pershing's introduction to his units. Patton had died following a car accident in Germany in December 1945 and never saw the tank that carried his name. The naming was probably not intended as irony, though it is difficult not to notice it. The M46 became the first in what would be known as the Patton series, a line of medium tanks that formed the core of American and Allied armored formations through much of the Cold War era. By the early 1950s, the M46 and its successors had displaced the M26 in frontline units. Surviving Pershings went to storage depots, were transferred to Allied nations under military assistance programs, or were placed on concrete pads as war memorials at bases and armories across the United States. The type seemed headed for quiet retirement. Then, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea with a force that included over 200 T-34-85 tanks. The American military, substantially downsized since 1945, and configured more for occupation duty in Japan and Germany than for a ground war in Asia, scrambled to find usable armor for the peninsula. The occupation divisions in Japan had light tanks and some armored cars, but nothing that could stop a T-34 frontally. Early assessments from theater even suggested Korea's mountainous terrain was unsuitable for tank operations, an evaluation that collapsed once North Korean T-34-85s began overrunning American infantry positions that had no effective anti-tank capability beyond the 2.36-inch bazooka, whose shaped charge warhead could not penetrate the T-34's glacis at any range. The shortage of deployable tanks was severe enough that some Pershings were pulled off their memorial pedestals at Fort Knox, where they had stood as monuments for several years, and restored to running condition for shipment across the Pacific. The restoration process was not trivial. Vehicles that had been sitting outdoors on display required engine overhauls, new batteries, replacement of perished rubber components in the road wheels and track pads, and recalibration of fire control equipment. That the Army went to this effort says something about how thin the inventory had become. In total, 309 M26s were sent to Korea in 1950, drawn from depots, training centers, and those memorial pedestals. They were not the most current equipment available, but their 90mm guns could destroy a T-34 reliably at any practical engagement range, and their frontal armor held against the T-34's 85mm gun in the engagements that occurred during the summer and fall fighting. By the end of 1950, U.S. after-action reports credited M26s with destroying 29 North Korean T-34s, while losing 6 Pershings to enemy tank fire, a ratio that reflected both the training disparity between the two sides and the generational gap between the vehicle designs themselves. One engagement from the Korean fighting stood out and became widely known within the armored community. Sergeant First Class Ernest Kuma's crew found their Pershing cut off and facing repeated waves of North Korean infantry advancing on their position and strength that far exceeded what a single tank crew would expect to handle alone. Over a period of roughly 9 hours, the crew fought continuously, using the coaxial and hull machine guns along with the main gun to break up successive assaults at close range. The tactical situation was straightforward in the worst possible way. There was no route for withdrawal, no supporting infantry close enough to help, and the North Korean troops kept pressing forward in numbers. Ammunition stocks dropped toward critical levels, and sustained firing overheated the weapon barrels. But Kuma held his crew together and kept the tank in action through each wave. When the fighting ended and a count was made, more than 250 enemy casualties were found around the position. The outcome depended on crew discipline and composure under extreme pressure, more than on any single characteristic of the vehicle. But the Pershing's armor protection kept the crew alive through hours of close-range fire that a thinner-skinned vehicle might not have survived. Kuma was subsequently promoted to Master Sergeant and received the Medal of Honor from President Truman for his actions during that engagement. The Pershing, which had arrived too late and in too few numbers to influence the fighting in Europe, had found its combat reputation in an entirely different theater on the other side of the globe. Korea also exposed the M26's mechanical limitations, under conditions that were considerably less forgiving than the relatively flat roads of Western Germany and the Low Countries. The peninsula's mountainous terrain, with steep gradients often exceeding what the drivetrain was designed for, narrow tracks carved into hillsides, and unpaved roads that turned to mud in the rainy season, punished the underpowered engine relentlessly. Overheating was a constant problem on long climbs, and the low power-to-weight ratio left the tank struggling on grades that a lighter vehicle could manage without difficulty. The running gear wore out at an accelerated rate under these conditions, and field repairs were complicated by the weight of major components. An engine change or transmission swap required heavy lift equipment not always available at forward repair positions in the Korean mountains. Reports from unit commanders were specific, detailed, and persistent in identifying the M26 as unsuitable for sustained operations in that terrain. By 1951, the decision was made to withdraw the Pershings from Korea and replace them with vehicles better matched to conditions on the peninsula. Two types took over: refurbished M4A3E8 Shermans, valued above all for their mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance in the field, and the newer M46 Pattons, which retain the Pershing's basic layout and armament, while correcting the worst of its powertrain shortcomings. The M26's active combat career was finished. It had been a vehicle shaped by institutional timing as much as by engineering. Conceived in response to a real tactical need, delayed by doctrinal disagreements and production priorities, and fielded too late to affect the conflict it was designed for. What the Pershing did leave behind was a platform and a design philosophy that proved more durable than the vehicle itself. The M46, M47, and M48 Pattons all descended directly from the T-26 lineage, carrying forward its basic architecture: the 90mm class main armament, the cast turret design, the torsion bar suspension layout, and the general hull configuration, through successive rounds of refinement and improvement. Each generation addressed specific weaknesses of its predecessor, while preserving the fundamental relationship between crew positions, automotive components, and fighting capability that the T-26 had established. For 2 decades of Cold War armored planning and procurement, every American medium tank in frontline service traced its engineering ancestry back to a vehicle that had spent most of its intended war sitting in a stateside warehouse waiting for a production order that came too late to matter.